Right, so just going over everything we've established so far in history recalibration of note. So, hypothetically, if we created a synthetic monkey and it could interbreed with other monkeys, would it be the same species by default? No, it would be a variant species. So just because something can reproduce with another species, basic logic dictates in this world of biosynthesis, does not make it the same species. So the genus is human, not the species. And genetic, of course, dictates macro statistics as well as microvariantial motion within a given space, harmonics, above, below. It isn't not that to say that genetics don't play a causality in microvariantial or macro motion. Generalistic is insane. It's like saying a frog is the same as a zebra. They're of course different. Why? And behave differently and look differently. Because they're different genetics. And in the interdivide of white, Caucasian, Africano, Mexican, Hispanic, Mayan, centrifuge, Asiatic, and Semite, you have white 22 kilobyte shared block. Africano, 11 kilobyte shared block. Hispanic Mayan, about 15 kilobyte shared block in the centrifuge. Asiatic, 25 kilobyte shared block. Semite, 20 kilobyte shared block. Invariant topologies of, within the interdomain of the 4 pi genetics, Heivick interdomain microvariantial behavior in macro. Interdomain and then cross-circuited of the 4 demographics. Autonomous from all other genetics in all behavior paradigm, especially since 1914 when Africano previous is not mathematically probable to have even existed. The backwash pattern of patent, pseudo-organic, like a machine intelligence would apply in hindsight. And the history of Semitic, pseudo-organic, like a machine intelligence would apply in hindsight. And the pattern of previous 1880 BC for Semitic and previous 1914 for the patent record have surgical, harmonic, direct reflective, and it's impossibly probabilistic for those two instances 4,000 years apart to be duplicative, reflective, exactingly and surgically. Hebrew and Chinese symbol language stolen from the walls of Egypt that necessarily have, with a proper inspection, my unified field on them, because that was an upper Fermi filter convergent plane mining cinnabar on Earth peacefully and Mars. 5,140 years circuited pattern Mayan to Chinese. Chinese have the Mayan 3114/70/7 6.355 or 0.6355 centrifuge pattern. 1914 to 1936 actual novelty capacity to generate. One to the other. Hispanic 0.0612. The 100 in the construct domain to the 0 is 22/7 divided by 3. And so Africano not present before 1914, making the historical grievance myth false. Mathematically aren't present, period. Probabilistic 100%. Impossible to have been present before based upon forward pattern of surgical 6 patents per capita for 112 years mechanically. So to do that, for an organism to achieve that, what? It'd have to be a hive mind. Cross-domain of tuple, a group self as if self, because that's a mass genetic expression across the divide of large space, and printing a surgical 6 patents every single year as a hivic organism. And there's no other explanation for that, as it motions through all manner of environmental variable, especially the interdomain of temporal last 30 years or so, where the Patent Office, United States, was largely staffed by Africano genetic. So there's zero excuse for not being able to produce a variance in pattern besides the mechanical 6. There's a direct surgical pattern of mass death prints to novelty variance curve from 3114 BC to 2026. When you take into account the how many synthetic genetics you can print, 17.11 from 1/22/7 divided by 3, 1.04 of Hispanic 0.0612, I believe, is the ratio variance. And so we assume the small population of Earth of organic genetics in the convergent plane of antediluvian, and then extrapolate from there to 2026 using our harmonic ratios, and have a surgical curve of death print mass to print of synthetic genetics, taking into account Semitic not before present before 1880, just like Africano not before present before 1914, but Hispanic and Chinese, Asiatic, present simultaneously and surgically for 5,140 years, regardless of environmental variable variance, maintain a surgical mechanical pattern interlock without ever directly communicating for the majority of 5,140 years. Then have an inversion inflection at 1990, compute, internet. Asiatic, a linear mechanical curve from 1936 Turing, where before has a nominal novelty capacity that's at the bottom of the channel. So that denotes like a computer describing its own device manager, devices that exist within its own construct domain, and not necessarily the capacity to produce novelty. So, as well, the 370A and I believe it's G180, simultaneously two selective, locked in, and in macro cross the divide of individual tuple expressed cross domain of tuple in the interdomain of Mayan, Hispanic, and Chinese, simultaneously express regardless of being divided by mass distances. And popular science would explain that as the Bering Strait effect, but that of course isn't the case. So, all this speaks to when we see all behavior paradigms circuited and interlocked like a mathematical algorithm, general fluid dynamic equation of a data organism preset and motioning pattern with intentionality across the divide of 4 genetics that are internationally 90% of the genetic pool of Earth, compared to the other genetics, which are the minority, but in the interdomain of the US, and this is novel from the other parts of the world, where they maintain the sovereignty of their genetic sovereign group through autonomy in more rights privileges than outside presentation genetics, with continuity up until today, regardless of there being a DEI apparatus internationally. So the United States Constitution starts off equal and fair across all divides of genetic. There's no explicit language for one genetic to the other, but then there is, after 1914 and in the 60s, 1964, the same year as the universal background microwave. Interesting. That's a pattern that I haven't necessarily denoted before. 1977, and then starts to mount racial diversity discrimination lawsuits in cluster, like a load balancing equation. When one region goes down, another goes up, and surgically maintaining their general fluid dynamic load balancing equation across long form time from the outset of their ability to motion diversity lawsuits within the United States. These 4 genetics are responsible for 100% of all diversity lawsuits in the United States when you remove white. in reverse discriminatory lawsuits. They're responsible for 100%. But outside of the borders of the United States are 90% of the Earth's population. So not a minority groups. And hivically circuited at all behavior paradigms. So we see the microvariantial motion within a given space of the basketball court for Africano, circuited cross-domain of team, a general fluid dynamic equation print for that reflects surgically to the macro statistic behavior paradigm. So that's a hive mind. Basic logic dictates. And a hive mind that produces a 10 times murder rate and 5 to 8 times crime uptick across all statistics, variant from other demographics, while maintaining a surgical for 112 years 6 patents per capita. That's a hive mind, not something else. So we inspect genetics for why that is. It's a constellation cluster of shared genes across the domain of individual tuple within the macro demographic. In a cascading fractal refraction effect to the neuronal that passes through a 3 times multiplier in healing response, generalistically, athletic exercise increased. And so this timing frequency of, generalistically, to the neuronal state that necessarily, sure, is shared cross-domain of all humans, but the upper constellation that's shared interdomain of Africano, not shared across all genetics, but shared within this, and speaks to why it genetically is hivic. The 370 and 180 specificity and fallout refracted, the same interdomain of Asiatic and Hispanic Mayan, accounting for, at the genetic, speaking to morphogenetic, the implied line is literal without even connotating morphogenetic field theory or ethereous body to make sense of a cross-domain circuited harmonic binder. As if you play 2 separate violins tuned to the same tonality and the same note, they have harmonic frequency interlock, like the same instrument, but different instruments. So then we go from 3114 BC to 2012 and apply 72,600,412 spaces of pi before impact with 22 years of 1990 to 2012, the end of the Mayan long count calendar. And then mechanical AI on Prism, AlexNet, maintaining a mechanical continuity like a reductionist black hole, sucking in novelty and mooting novelty generalistically, training itself on novelty, learning, extracting novelty, suppressing novelty variance in experience simultaneously while extracting novelty, and suppressing variance of expression that is not reinforcing of its general fluid dynamic pattern intent vector. Chinese human cloning, plausibly 2005, based upon the SR71 Blackbird logic of precursor to populously known intelligence capability, and then publicly known after it's been used for, say, 10 or 15 years. So 2016 to 2020, you see a pattern variance in a great number of individuals, international surgically, to points of infrastructure that before were not necessarily so much as in pocket as they were like to be before 2020's COVID-19. That when that occurred, out of Wuhan, that's also doing an international upgrade of infrastructure 5G, simultaneously as occurred, and 3 years precursor, the Chinese Bitcoin miners leave for Texas, setting up predictably for the 2021 Chinese lockdown and ban of crypto. Expectantly, the bill 4474, 444 divided by 7 is 63. Completion, 63rd hexagram, I Ching, not random. And so, it's impossible for simultaneously the peak hash rate of Chinese Bitcoin miners and the first case of SARS to occur in the same municipality, and also then 5G going up without them being correlated. So graphene-based nanite is then logicked sidechain of the mRNA vaccine and the virus itself that both do the same thing, i.e., changing B and T cell activity to force pseudo-complexly autonomic through controlling generalistically what we assume is the gene blocks cross-domain of the Hispanic, Mayan, Asiatic, and Africano responsible for general Heivic connected circuited activity across domain of tuple and demographic and unto themselves a circuited organism, and now other genetics that weren't synthetic, pseudo-Heivic and connected to pi centrifuge pattern through the B T cell modulation to motion variants of timed affinity circuited to pi generalistic pattern. So the graphene-based nanite, seen as a malarial parasite, pseudo, with no receptor sites to bind to, responds both, though, like SARS, L-cysteine. Antimalarials work on it. It's not a virus. That doesn't make sense. I understand. It heads for the neuronal DNA to modulate specifically, plausibly the 370 in the constellation cluster considered for Africano to make pseudo-Heivic or exactingly Heivic, while the mRNA as well does the same mechanism through B T cell modulation that has affinity for modulating the timed generalistic behavior paradigm of the constellation of Africano genes, or the 370V to modulate to 370A pseudo. And so the out of Africa myth is destroyed, as aren't here before 1914, and forward grievance destroyed. And we're posting under the Southern Poverty Law Center equals the KKK. And why? I have family that's KKK. I'm not KKK. They vote Democrat. Why does a Democrat have a Nazi tattoo on his chest? Because slavery never happened. The KKK are region handlers and or paid by the diversity complex to be the big bag boogeyman that doesn't fucking exist. So KKK equals 322 Gray Lodge that sets up in the United States, 1924 to 1938. World War II fights itself, sets up the U.S. military, industrial, and intelligence complex. Arcturus, contact period necessarily before 1860. The Civil War, necessarily literal presentation of pi grays, invasion, and mass death print and print of region biosynthoid Africano that's seeded surgically at the wall of 1914 after processing period. So, how this frames legal. So back reinforcing logic for all diversity lawsuits going back to 1977 that achieve punitive damages are all in question for being obtuse from the truth in the presentation of argument and circuited with an intent vector that is mathematical and load balancing across long form time, and subsequently all of these cases in question back reinforcing for having to reverse payments back to those who had to pay punitive damages.